Story time about how my crazy neighbors ate my dog. By the way, this is an anonymous story from a follower. So me and my boyfriend had just bought our first house together. Everyone welcomed us to the new neighborhood, but we didn't have neighbors to the right side of us yet. No one was in the house yet. So about 6 months into us living there, we get our brand new neighbors. So obviously, since we've been there for 6 months, we introduced ourselves to them. So our neighbors were these two grown men. They didn't even have any furniture in their house, so that kind of stood out. We thought later they'd get moving trucks and move in some furniture, but they never did. So me and my boyfriend had a Pomeranian named Chippy. Sometimes we would let our dog go outside to use the restroom, and every time I went outside to get the dog, I noticed our neighbors were just staring at me. So one day I let Chippy go outside to use the restroom, and when I was ready to bring him back in, I couldn't find him anywhere. So I'm looking around, I'm literally looking everywhere, and he is nowhere to be found. So I go back into the house to tell my boyfriend, and then a few minutes later we get a knock on the door. And it's both of our neighbors like, hey, we found your dog in your front yard. Like for part 2. Part 2 story time about how my crazy neighbors ate my dog. By the way, this is an anonymous story. So after our neighbors bring by our dog, we started to get suspicious for sure. Things just weren't adding up at all. So one day a kid across the street saw our dog Chippy and wanted to play with him. So I said, of course, only if you make sure nothing happens. Obviously, I didn't think anything would happen. That kid loved our dog. So as the kid is playing with our dog Chippy, the neighbors are looking out of the window watching him. So they come outside of their house and they go, hey, can I play with him? And the boy says, yeah, but you can't let anything happen to him. Then our neighbor goes, oh, of course not. I play with Chippy all the time. The boy then goes, okay, well, I have to go home now. Make sure Chippy gets back to his owner. He says, of course, nothing's going to happen to Chippy. So the boy goes back into his house, and our neighbors bring Chippy inside of their house. So after about an hour or so, I go outside to see what's going on. Chippy is missing yet again. Like for part 3. Story time about how I found out who my real mom was. So long story short, I was given up for adoption because my real mom was into drugs. She signed me away as soon as I was born, and boom, I was in a new family. I was 15 at this time, so I was a sophomore in high school, and everything was pretty cool. My parents who adopted me always told me whenever I got to a certain age, I could go talk to my real mom if I wanted to. But at 15 years old, I wasn't allowed to. So one day we got this brand new teacher, and her name was Mrs. Green. And it was funny because my birth last name is Green. It's a common name, so no, it didn't stand out to me. I soon became the teacher's favorite. I was always smart in all of my classes, so this was no surprise to me. But what surprised me was when she started saying how beautiful and smart I was and how she knew I would go far in life. So sometime later, after having this new teacher, I started to tell my parents about her. As soon as I told them that her name was Mrs. Green, they instantly got chills. They tried not to make a big deal out of it, but like for part 2. This is part 2 about how I found out who my real mom was. So like I said in part 1, my parents were definitely alarmed because they already know everything about my real mom. But I guess they didn't want to alert me, so they let everything go by. So the next day at school, my teacher, Mrs. Green, pulls me aside and says, I have to talk to you. So she says, honey, you're so smart. Your parents must be so proud of you. So she then goes, do you mind if I speak with your parents, Mr. and Mrs. Green? Do you think we could sit down for a second? And I go, sure, but that's not their last names. She says, why not? And I go, oh, I'm adopted. She then says, do you know who your real parents are? I'm like, no, I only know a couple things about them. Why? She says, I have to tell you something. I'm your mother. In my head, I was like, what in God's name? How are you here? I'm like, how are you my real mom? How are you my teacher? Wait, what is going on here? So she says, I'd really like for all 4 of us to please sit down and talk something out. Like for part 3. Part 3 story time about how I found out who my real mom was. So like I said in part 2, my teacher was desperate to sit down with all 4 of us to talk something out. So I frantically say, yeah, sure, okay. So as I head home, and I mean I am speeding home, I tell my parents everything that happened. They then told me, oh yeah, she's been trying to get in contact with you. We just never told you. We were going to wait until you got older. Apparently, she's been watching my every move because she went sober and wanted to get back in contact with me. So as my parents are telling me that it's not safe to be around her and we should just move schools, I'm like, she is my birth mother and I'd like to see where she's coming from. So after talking it out for a while, they agreed that we could sit down and talk to her about it. So once we sat down and talked everything out, we decided that I would see her once a week. So one week I went over to her house and she said, hey, let's take a trip somewhere. I wasn't comfortable doing that, but she said we were just going to go to the store. Once I got in the car, we were driving for over an hour. She pulled over and tried to give me drugs. She was never sober. I sent my mom my location. I haven't seen her. Story time about how I found out my dad was gay. So growing up, I always had a pretty typical family, dog, brother, and both my parents. My dad, who was extremely busy, had an office job, and my mom was a nurse. I was a senior in high school, and life was pretty cool. I never really got to spend a lot of time with my dad because he was always working extremely late hours in his office. Right before I would go to school and before he'd go to work, he'd kiss me on the forehead and be out the door. One day I was too sick to go to school, so I stayed home, and I noticed that my dad got an alert on his phone. Right before I was about to give it to him, I decided to see what it was because I noticed it was from Tinder. The name that popped up said Emmanuel Johnson. I was so confused. I didn't look too much into it just because I wanted to stay out of his business, so he came and got his phone anyway. So some weeks later, my dad decided to take me to school. As we were driving to school, I saw the name Emmanuel pop up on the screen calling him. He quickly declined it. I told my friends what had been going on, and they had the craziest idea for me to figure this out, like for part 2. Part 2 about how I found out my dad was gay. So once I got to school, I told my friends that the same man, Emmanuel, has been in consistent contact with my dad for some reason. I had never heard of him before, and my dad has mentioned everyone that he knows. So one of my friends that did art design for the school plays had a great idea. He suggested that I dress up as a man and spy on my dad while he was at work. So one day I pretended to go to school when really I went to my friend's house so he could dress me up. He put a bald cap on me, fake skin, a mustache, a suit, stubble, the whole nine. I really looked like a man. So I'm so nervous, but we pull up to my dad's job and I hurry up and creep in the building. Before going to his office, I stop by the restroom just to make sure nothing is falling off. So as I'm looking in the restroom and fixing my face, I hear a toilet flush and someone comes out. It was my dad. I had the biggest heart attack that he would recognize me. When I tell you, I looked straight down and didn't say anything. As he's drying his hands, he goes, "Hey, I don't think I've seen you around here. What's your name?" Like for part 3. Part 3 story time about how I found out my dad was gay. So like I said in part 2, he goes, "What's your name?" And he's saying it in a weird way. So I go, my name is James. Then he goes, "Well, hi, James. I just wanted to tell you that you look very familiar." Now, at this point, I'm sweating bullets because I'm like, I know who I am. I am your daughter. And I go, "Really? Who do I look like?" And he says, "Well, you look like this guy I used to date in college." I had to keep from passing out. I was spying on him thinking I was going to find him talking to someone named Emmanuel. In that moment, I was like, my work here is done. I have to go. So I said, "Oh, nice. See ya." I run back to the car in a panic, ripping all of that shit off. I said to my friends, "Take me home. I have to talk to my mom." So I sat my mom down and told her everything that happened. After telling my mom everything, she then says, "I know, honey, but we need the money." Story time about how I had to beat my grandma's ass. So to give you a quick little backstory about my grandma was not innocent. She used to run the streets back in her day. So I wasn't that close to my grandma, and neither was my mom, but my mom would still try to help her out from time to time and give her money. So one day, my dumb grandma and her dumb old friends decided to go rob a bunch of people. Now, of course, they old asses get caught, and my mother has to bail them out. So after my mom gets her from the jail, she's going on the whole time in the car like, "You should have given me more money." So they're arguing and everything, and my mom's like, "I don't understand why you're complaining. I always help you out when you ask me." My grandma feels like she shouldn't have to ask because she's her mother. So we're bringing my grandma back to her house, and as soon as we pull in the driveway, she gets out of the car and slams the door and goes inside. So as me and my mom are walking up the stairs to get inside, my grandma opens the door with a pistol. She's threatening to shoot her if she doesn't give her more money. Like for part 2. Story time about how I had to beat my own grandma's ass. So like I said in part 1, that old ass lady pulled out a pistol on my goddamn mama. Now, mind you, we are in the hood, so seeing pistols is not a big thing to most people in that neighborhood. Long story short, nobody called the cops, so we had to handle it ourselves. So I'm trying to calm my grandma down, and then she aims it at me. That's when my mom lost it. So she tries to grab the gun, and my grandma was not feeling that. So with my grandma's free hand, she swings on my mom, hitting her in the face. Now this was some ghetto ass shit. So my mom and grandma are on the ground fighting like some ghetto ass hood rats. And I didn't want to have to fight my grandma, but she started putting the gun to my mom's head. So I get on top of my grandma and I start whooping that ass. Because at this point, I was convinced she was actually going to shoot her. So I'm kicking her old ass in the back and dragging her off by her gray ass hair. As soon as I got them separated, I called the police, got her old ass locked up, and no, we did not bail her out this time. Best/worst date ever. So I was in a relationship with this guy who was very emotionally / physically abusive sometimes. He was so insecure, like literally anytime I was even on my phone, he would take it from me just to see what was keeping my attention. So one day this guy DMs me and he's telling me how beautiful I am and how much he'd like to get to know me. After exchanging messages with him a few times, I could tell he had pure intentions. I felt so guilty but so afraid because I didn't want my original boyfriend to find out. He would have tried to kill me. So instead of DMing, I told him to just email me so it'd be less suspicious. So after talking for a few weeks, I tried to call things off because I was catching real feelings for him. He made me feel so much better than my boyfriend ever did. So once I told him the type of person that I was and how bad I'd feel for cheating on my boyfriend, I called things off. By the way, his name was Carter, and my boyfriend's name was Jackson. So some weeks went by without me speaking to Carter, and Valentine's Day came up. So Jackson takes me to this fancy restaurant. Once we're seated, I recognize someone there. Like for part 2. Part 2 about my best / worst date ever. By the way, this is an anonymous story. So once me and Jackson get seated, I recognize this guy. I can only see the side of his face, but he definitely looked familiar. So every so often I would look over there to see if I recognized him from somewhere. So as I was looking at him one other time, he looked at me and we caught eye contact for a split second. Then it hit me. It was Carter. Carter was the guy who DM'd me, and he's literally at the same restaurant as I am. So Jackson starts to notice that I'm distracted by something, and he's looking behind him trying to see who I'm looking at. So he goes, "Why the F are you looking around the restaurant for? I'm your boyfriend. I took you on this date and you're being so ungrateful." So as Jackson's trying to see who I'm looking at, Carter turns around and looks at me again. And he goes, "Are you okay?" Jackson then goes, "Are you making eyes at this guy?" And he takes his whole drink and throws it in my face. He stands up making a scene, yelling and cursing at me. So Carter came over there, like for part 3. Part 3 about my worst / best date ever. By the way, this story is anonymous. So once Carter comes over there to see if I'm okay, Jackson stands up ready to fight him. So the girl that Carter was sitting with runs over there. And she goes, "Who is this girl and why are you trying to fight for her?" Carter simply says she's in trouble and her boyfriend is treating her like crap. So she goes, "Well, if you care more about her, then you can just be with her." Then she leaves. So Carter and Jackson get into a fight and they're on top of the table, slamming the food everywhere. I got salad on me, drinks on me, everything, you name it. So after the waiter split us up, they put everybody out. After we were out, Carter demanded that I get in his car and not in Jackson's. Jackson threatened to kill me if I got in his car, so Carter called the police. Once the police showed up, Jackson was arrested for threatening my life. Once me and Carter sat in his car for hours, we were connecting with everything. I honestly hadn't been that happy in forever. Long story short, that story was 2 years ago, and we're going to tell it to our soon-to-be-born child. Story time about how I slept with my own dad. By the way, this story is anonymous. Now, keep in mind, I never knew who my dad was from birth, but I knew he lived in the same state as me. So I was a senior in college and it was getting so hard for me to graduate. So one day I went in early to speak with our professor about the homework, and we had a new professor. I was so upset because our other professor was so lenient with me. He understood everything. I was going to have to catch this new dude up on everything. I was hoping he wasn't strict, but just like I thought, he was extremely strict. He went by Professor Tom, which was his first name because he said it made him feel old to go by his last. So graduation started coming up and I was talking to my best friend like, "Girl, what should I do?" I was failing so many of my classes. It was just so hard. Then when I told her we had a new professor, she was like, "Oh, girl, you screwed." So once me and her got to class the next day, she was like, "Oh, girl, he is cute." She's like, "You know what you're going to have to do by the end of the semester if you're still failing, right?" Like for part 2. Part 2 story time about how I slept with my biological father. By the way, this story is very anonymous. So my best friend was suggesting that I had to sleep with him to pass my classes. I did not want to take it there, but by the way my grades was looking, I had no choice. So I asked him to start tutoring me after classes. He agreed to tutor me and I got a lot closer to him. So one day I came in for tutoring and I locked the door. I told him I had a surprise for him just to show appreciation for him helping me. He was like, "And what is that?" Long story short, we did the do on his desk. We both had a great time. After that, my grades were not a problem. So the next day I was freaking out telling my best friend everything that happened. And she was kind of happy for me. So after classes I went home and my mom told me my dad was coming over for dinner. She was like, "Honey, he's moved closer to us so he can get closer to you." She goes, "He actually just started teaching after college." My stomach hit the floor. So I hear someone knock on the door and I am sweating. She opens the door. It's my professor. I blacked out and I don't remember anything after that. Story time about how I found out my mom faked her death so she wouldn't have to be our parent anymore. So it was me and my brother Jeremy, and after I turned about 5, my mom started complaining that she was getting sick and couldn't go back to work. She was always bedridden, and she was always having people make food for us, and she was just never really attentive like that. So here and there, she would have this random black car come pull up to the house, and she always told us that she was going to appointments. So that's what we believed. She would come back and just keep us posted and say that the doctor gave her a prescription and that she should be fine. As the years went on, me and my brother Jeremy, who was younger than me, he was 12 and I was 15 at this time, we just started taking care of her for the rest of our lives. We barely had a social life or really any social skills or normal high school experience because we felt like our mom could die any second. And she would always tell us, "Don't you notice how much weight I'm losing?" Because the clothes that she would wear were really big. So one morning, that same black car came and got her, and she went to the hospital, and she never came back, like for part 2. This is part 2 about how my mom faked her own death. So like I said in part 1, that black car came and supposedly took her to the hospital, but she never came back. So of course, me and my younger brother Jeremy were curious about why she wasn't coming back. So after a whole week of our aunt babysitting us, we kept asking her, "Where's our mom?" And she looked so uncomfortable and cringy every time she told us that, "Oh, she's still in the hospital." So it's officially been 2 weeks, and my aunt got a weird phone call in the middle of the night. She woke up me and my little brother Jeremy and told us that our mom had passed away from an unknown disease. So only about 5 to 10 minutes after me and Jeremy were crying, our aunt went to her bedroom. I dropped out of school and everything because it just made me depressed that my entire life my mom was sick. So some time later, I asked my aunt about the funeral, and she said that she was going to be cremated, so there would be no funeral. So after my mother was cremated, my aunt kept the urn locked in a cabinet and said we weren't allowed to touch it ever. This gets bad, like for part 3. Part 3 about how my mama faked her own death. So like I said in part 2, we weren't allowed to touch the urn. My aunt kept it locked away in a cabinet. I was 15 at the time, but as some years went on, I turned 18, and I just wanted to see it. After all, it was my mom's. So one day, for some reason, I just couldn't sleep, and I was staying up extremely late. I heard my aunt getting ready to leave the house, so I decided to stay up to see where she was going. I looked out of the window, and the same mysterious black car that used to pick my mom up when I was 5 came to pick her up. That was weird, so after she left, I started looking around through all of her mail, all of her clothes for that key. So I found the key to the urn, and I went to the urn, unlocked it, and you will never guess what I found in there. It was flour. It wasn't even ashes. She put flour in the urn. That's why we weren't allowed to touch it. Once I got used to my aunt's schedule, I followed her next time. So as I'm spying through this weird house, I see my aunt talking to my mom. Once I screamed at both of them for a good hour, I found out that my mom paid my aunt to pretend that she was dead. She wanted a fresh start at life, but instead went to jail.